I think one of the important things about skepticism and about anomalistic psychology, in fact, is that anomalistic psychology is a great way of teaching critical thinking skills in a kind of fairly painless way, because people are fascinated by this kind of an area. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, most people, once you start talking about ghosts and UFOs and all these things, they've got something to say about it, they've got views about it, so they're interested, and that's a very good starting point. And then you can get on to issues about, well, why should you value some kinds of evidence more than others? And in particular, issues like, why should you in fact not value personal experience? I mean, for most people, I saw it with my own eyes, that's the ultimate proof. But as a psychologist, I'm afraid, well, I'm sorry, there's all kinds of reasons why I'm not going to be convinced by you telling me you saw it with your own eyes. But to actually be able to then present counter explanations that hopefully make sense, and I think that's important. Not just the kind of skeptic who says, "Oh, astrology, that's rubbish, couldn't possibly be true, with no scientific mechanism whereby it could happen, therefore it doesn't happen." That's not going to convince somebody who's been to see an astrologer and been blown away by the reading they've had. But if you tell them about cold reading, and if you tell them about the psychology of why people might believe and sometimes be drawn down that path, then it's much more likely, if they go and see an astrologer again, they'll be thinking about those things, and they might think, yeah, actually, that was very general, that does apply to everybody, and yeah, hang on, you're just fishing now, and all these kind of things. And I think that's going to be much more effective in terms of kind of changing people's minds. And I also think that you can then, there are some areas of life where skepticism can just serve a very good kind of purpose in terms of consumer protection. So if we're talking about areas like astrology, alternative medicine, a whole range of other areas, then a little bit of knowledge of anomalistic psychology can go a long way. But also, more generally, when it comes to assessing claims of all sorts, claims that politicians are making, claims that advertisers are making, when they're nothing to do with the paranormal, you can still apply those same kind of skills. And essentially the bottom line is, as I said earlier, show me the evidence. Don't just tell me that this is the way things are. Show me why you think that. And I think that again can be very, very, very useful, and it can apply much more widely than just things that are obviously related to the paranormal. Yeah, I'm actually a bit of a closet fan of Rupert Sheldrake's, but don't tell anyone, No, I know Rupert personally, and we get on very well. And I've seen Rupert do lots of presentations, and I think very often in debates with skeptics, he runs rings around them. And the reason he does that is he's not starting from a position of... sometimes when he debates with a certain kind of skeptic, the skeptic will start the debate with, well, we all know this is impossible. And that's the starting point. There's no room for manoeuvre on that one, so the debate's not really going to go anywhere. So when Rupert then says, but I've done experiments, I've got this data, this is what I found, if you adopt the approach of, don't bother me with your data, I don't want to look at your data, it's really kind of playing into Rupert's Galileo complex, it's kind of, they wouldn't even look through the telescope kind of thing. Now, I'm not convinced that Rupert's claims are correct, and we have worked together on various projects and never produced any kind of compelling evidence that's reliable and replicable that any of these things are true. Now, I'm intrigued by that, because I personally do not think that Rupert is a fraud. I don't think, again, lots of skeptics get very, very derogatory about him and refer to him as being a complete nutter. Again, I don't think that's fair at all. But I am intrigued by the fact that he does seem to very often get positive results, whereas when I try to repeat those experiments, I typically don't. So what's going on there? And I think there's something interesting about digging down into that to try to find out what he's telling us about the kind of scientific method. And recently, there's been a big debate in psychology about replication issues, and replication has been the biggest problem for parapsychology ever since the year dot. why is it that you can sometimes get what appear to be positive results in reasonably well conducted experiments? You can always find niggly little faults here and there. But what is it that kind of fills up the pages of the parapsychology journals? I mean, unless we believe that all of these people are just engaged in deliberate fraud, and I think that's silly, I don't think that's true, there's something kind of interesting going on there. And I think what the answer probably is, and this is something that's being debated a lot in psychology at the moment, are what's been referred to as questionable research practices, QRPs. And it's not that we're talking about people engaging in out-and-out fraud, although that does happen, it happens in all areas of science, but it's probably, hopefully, quite rare. What's far more common is giving yourself the benefit of the doubt. When you're carrying out any experiment, there are lots of choice points where you can, I'll just give you a few examples. If you run a psychology experiment and you stopped after running 20 participants and you analysed your data, and if you've got a significant result, you write it up and submit it. If you haven't, you run another 10 participants to see whether you might get it that way. Doesn't sound like a major crime, but it's increasing the chances of spuriously significant results. You're giving yourself 2 bites of the cherry. Do you include those outliers or do you exclude them? Do you transform your data or don't you? You can justify all these decisions, but it's very often the case that you'll run the experiment, you'll do the analysis that you planned. If the effect doesn't seem to come out, you'll then have a look at the data and think, oh, what's going on there then? And you might try something else, and then eventually you'll squeeze that effect out that you were looking for. Not deliberate fraud at all, not even something that is certainly not best practice in the kind of pure sense. But I think it's far more common than people realise. You combine that with publication bias, so that the top journals do not want straight replications, they're just not interested. We've experienced this ourselves. And they also want positive findings. So if you do a really nice experiment, but you get negative findings, or if you try and replicate somebody else's controversial finding and you don't, you'll find it very hard to get that published in a decent journal. And therefore, you'll probably either not bother to write it up at all, or probably not even bother to do a straight replication in the first place, because you know that there is this bias. But this distorts the entire research literature, and certainly it's a big problem in psychology. It will also apply to parapsychology. I mean, a line that I find myself coming out with quite a lot these days is that science is all about trying to separate the signal from the noise. What would a science look like if it was nothing but noise? I think it would look like parapsychology. I think when it comes to trying to evaluate Rupert Sheldrake's kind of view of the universe and all these ideas about morphic fields and morphic resonance and so on and so forth, I think one of the reasons that people find his explanations appealing is he does actually take people's personal experiences seriously. So if we take the example of telephone telepathy, we've all experienced that. And whether or not you believe it's a paranormal phenomenon, you know what's being talked about. You say, yeah, I've had that, I know what that is. Now, again, Rupert is very well aware of all the sceptical counter-explanations. Oh, it's just a coincidence, it's selective memory, it's all these sorts of things. But he just asked the reasonable enough question, well, what if it's real? And he's designed experiments that produce positive, significant results that he says support the idea that there really is something going on there. I have to say, when we've tried, we generally don't get results that seem to support the idea that it's real. But one of the interesting points that Rupert makes is that people get very angry. A lot of skeptics get really, really angry and want to string him up by the nearest lamppost. When he talks about telephone telepathy, and yet you can get some physicists talking about parallel universes that we've never experienced directly, and everybody sits there going, yes, that's very clever, really interesting, And we don't question those kinds of ideas that are much more bizarre and out of our conceptual grasp and our personal experience than anything that he's talking about. So he takes people's experiences real, people who believe that, oh yeah, my dog always knows when I'm coming home, even though I come home unexpectedly, my dog knows that, and all of that kind of stuff. And I think people like that. And he's not just kind of prepared to just say, oh, well, there's a lot of scientists, well, that couldn't be true, so I don't need to look at the evidence. He actually will go to the trouble of setting up experiments and quite often claims to get significant positive results. Now, as I say, my personal view is I'm not persuaded by his results, partly on the basis of my own attempts to replicate, partly on my general kind of reading of the literature. Another thing that strikes me is if Rupert gets these results so reliably, why aren't there queues of parapsychologists replicating these effects? Because that's what parapsychology has needed for decades and decades and decades, is just one replicable, robust effect that you can prove to the outside world, this is a real effect. You know, this is something that needs explaining. And yet they're not there. So what is it with the wider I think the wider parapsychological community are a little bit suspicious of Rupert's research, because it seems that he gets effects that are much bigger than they usually get, that he gets them much more frequently. They're used to kind of things that bobbling about around the 0.05 level of significance, and sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't. And then Rupert gets these effects that, if they are real, are of quite a considerable effect size. So there's something really interesting going on there. As I say, I don't claim to know definitively one way or the other, and I think Rupert should be kind of treated as being a worthy contributor to the debate. As I say, I'm not convinced that he's right in the claims that he's making, but I think he deserves to be taken more seriously than he often is. I think there's a general problem in parapsychology, and Richard Wiseman's written some interesting stuff on this, about the way that parapsychologists often try to, as Richard put it, nullify null results. And this is why I think that sometimes you need those straight replication studies. They're not very exciting to do. We had a situation with respect to Darrell Bem's research where he caused worldwide media interest. This is a respected psychologist publishing in a very well respected mainstream psychology journal, presenting apparently evidence for precognition. So you can understand why the science media were really excited and interested. He did encourage people to try to replicate his results, and myself, Richard Wiseman and Stuart Ritchie, we all agreed between us that we'd each do an independent replication as close as we possibly could to the way that Bem had done it. When we failed to replicate the results, we wrote it up, we sent it into the same journal that had published the original paper, and the editor refused to even send it out for peer review, just rejected it straight away. We don't publish replications. So you've got good old publication bias. And we had this treatment from another couple of high-impact journals, and eventually we managed to get it published. Now, the reason we were so keen to do just a straight replication is that parapsychologists, and again I think Rupert Sheldrake would be included in this criticism, if you attempt to replicate an effect that they've reported and you do it in a slightly different way to the way that they did it, then if the effect comes out, they're happy to accept that as a replication. If it doesn't, they'll say, oh, it's because you didn't do it the way I did it. You know, so any minor variations, and I think this gets back to Occam's razor, etc. I think one of the criticisms of parapsychology that certainly move it towards the pseudoscience end of the spectrum. And I personally am one of the few skeptics who think that parapsychology is a science. But there's a kind of an absence of boundary conditions, as it's been referred to. There's not enough specification of, well, under what conditions do you not expect to get these effects? And so what happens is people run the experiment, and it's then decided afterwards, oh, well, actually, it's because you didn't have the right kind of participants, or you hadn't followed the procedure properly, or you didn't do this, or you didn't do that. That's why you didn't get the effect. And when we find this all the time when we test psychic claimants, we always insist that they sign something in advance saying, this is a fair test of my claim. And of course they then do the test, they fail the test, and then they decide it wasn't a fair test. But you can guarantee that if they passed the test, they wouldn't be sitting back thinking, oh no, actually we didn't do it right. They'd be trumpeted into the world, Well, I mean, the problem with anecdotal evidence is that there are so many other possible explanations for whatever is being claimed. I mean, it might be, the bottom line is the person telling you this story might just be deliberately lying, or they might be mistaken. It gets back to Hume's famous argument against miracles. David Hume argued that if ever you're told about some miraculous event, basically you should only believe the miraculous event if the evidence for it outweighs the evidence that it did not happen. Now, in practice, we know that people sometimes lie, and we know that people make mistakes. So logically, it's always going to be preferable to doubt that the miracle really did occur. Now, as I say, in fact, sometimes what appears to be a miraculous claim turns out it really is true, and so we need to be a bit wary of over-applying Hume's maxim, although I'm a great fan of Hume, and I think that what he has to say there makes a lot of sense. But, we know that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. We know that people have false memories. We know that people hallucinate. We know that people make stuff up. So, at the end of the day, anecdotes can be useful insofar as a collection of anecdotes that all seem to be pointing in a similar direction, suggesting that there might be something worth investigating properly and systematically. That's really where the value of anecdotes ends. They cannot on their own support a lot of the claims that people put forward for them. I mean, in certain areas of parapsychology are essentially collections of anecdotes. I mean, you're talking, if you're looking at areas like people's reports of ghostly encounters, or people's reports of alien contact, etc., etc., you don't have any kind of, or very, very rarely have anything that is presented as hard physical evidence. You've got someone's account of it. So it's never going to be enough on its own to convince me, for sure. The basic rationale behind the double-blind trial is that we need to be aware of our own biases, and we need to try and control for them. And what this means is that if, for example, you are testing some kind of, whether it be a psychic claim or a non-psychic claim, you need to take into account your own biases in terms of what you expect to find, what you'd like to find from the experiment, and so on. Now, what that means is that if, let's take the example of testing a psychic, I'll use an example, our test of dowsers. The way that we tested the dowsers, and we based this very much on previous work that had been done by Australian skeptics, so thank you to the Aussies for that. We got dowsers who claimed that they could differentiate between a bottle of sand and a bottle of water just by using dowsing rods. And we found that when we tested them in open trials, as we call them, where here's the water, here's the sand, they know where each bottle is. Over the water, nice dowsing reaction. Over the sand, nothing. Okay, great. Now put them inside these containers. They still know this is the sand, this is the water. Over the sand, nothing. Over the water, nice reaction. And then we go on to do the double-blind trials. So we seem to be getting a reaction when they know what the answer is. But then when we do it under double-blind conditions, we have 6 containers inside a marquee tent. Someone makes a random selection of which of the 6 containers is going to have a bottle of water, all the rest get sand, and then that person leaves the scene. And then the dowser plus the experimenter, another experimenter goes into the testing area, and they try to say which is the container that has the water. Now, the reason we're doing it that way is if we didn't do it that way, there's always the possibility that the experimenter could either intentionally or unintentionally give a clue as to where the target area is, or alternatively, they could even deliberately mislead. So it's a perfectly fair way of testing. Nobody in the testing area has any knowledge of what the right answer is, and therefore there's no possibility of any contamination. Now, it's interesting, and again we'll go back to my good friend Rupert Sheldrake here, that double-blind testing, although it's a kind of very honoured principle in science, is hardly ever used in the pure sciences, in the natural sciences, and is much more likely to be used in parapsychology. This is one of those areas where parapsychology actually gets a big tick compared to more mainstream sciences, because they are aware of the fact that people will criticise them if they don't do their experiments that way. Whereas in more mainstream sciences, I mean, in chemistry, if you add A plus B to in a test tube you get C plus D, and it happens time and time and time again. It doesn't matter whether you believe it's going to happen or whether you don't. And so people are not as aware of the need for double-blind testing. And I think by and large it's probably not unreasonable. Why waste all your time going to double-blind procedures where, in the vast majority of situations you don't need it, but you will then get isolated examples like the famous Benveniste homeopathy episode, where because of their lack of knowledge and understanding of the need for double-blind procedures, they were making claims that were just absolute nonsense and were not replicable, and it can happen. I mean, one of the interesting things with respect to dowsing is that, again, this is anecdotal evidence, but my personal impression from mixing with dowsers over the years is they come into two general categories. On the one hand, you have those people who believe in all things woo. They believe in dowsing, crystal energy, angels, astrology, the whole works, and they're not interested in science at all. But you've got an interesting subcategory of people who see themselves as being scientists. People who've got backgrounds in engineering or chemistry or proper sciences, and I think what's happening with them is that the first time they tried the dowsing rods, they probably didn't expect it to work, but my God, it does. Although they know a lot about science, they don't know necessarily that much about psychology, so they don't think maybe it's just that I'm moving it and not realising it. They think, some force is operating here, let's measure that force. They immediately go to that next step, and just never think in terms of, well, actually, you know what we need here? We need double-blind testing. That'll decide whether there really is something going on. But they completely bypass that stage, even though they ought to know better. The people who actually present themselves for testing by us, I do not doubt their sincerity at all. They are typically convinced that they are going to pass the test. I'm very shocked when they don't, even when we've explained how we are going to do the test. We've done tests on all kinds of people. We've tested various professional psychics, dowsers, etc. Just give you one illustration. We tested a guy called Derek Ogilvie, who referred to himself as the baby psychic. This is myself and Chrissy Wilson. And Derek claimed that he could read babies' minds, or toddlers or children, but even babies, before they could talk, he could read their minds. And it wasn't just a matter of, oops, I've just pooed myself, or I'm hungry. They could tell you all kinds of stuff about the kind of things that were going on in the family, about business affairs, about the comings and goings, about the family car, all sorts of stuff, amazingly intelligent, these 6-month-olds, And the way he would operate under non-controlled conditions, he would do his readings with the parents present. And he'd be coming out with stuff and the parents would be reacting. And essentially, I think what was going on was giving him the benefit of the doubt, unintentional cold reading. So obviously the way to rule that out is to say, okay, we'll get you to do the readings without the parents present. And we'll record all the readings, and then we get the parents to come back, and we have half a dozen readings that you've done, and only one of them will apply to their child. It ought to stick out like a sore thumb. There ought to be all kinds of information in there that just applies to your child in your family. Long story short, we did that. I believe that as he was being driven to do this test for us, he used the phrase, piece of piss. He thought he was going to sail through it. Surprise, surprise, you get 1 hit out of 6, exactly what you'd expect by chance. Poor guy's in tears afterwards, literally crying his eyes out. That's it, my career's over. And I'm there kind of saying, no, don't worry, don't you? None of your followers, none of your fans will take any notice of us. Your career's fine, which of course it turned out to be. But yeah, they're absolutely sincere. You wouldn't put yourself through that knowing. The only exception there might be somebody who was really, really clever and really fancied their chances and had a good understanding of conjuring techniques and deception and thought, I can outwit the people doing the test. But even there, you can only get away with that if you allow if the testers allow the claimant to take control of the situation. Uri Geller couldn't do anything under properly controlled conditions. And even I dare say, this is not a challenge, but I dare say if we try to test Derren Brown, if we set the testing conditions, he wouldn't be able to do the stuff he does. It's because he sets the testing conditions. There's a lot goes on behind the scenes that the viewers are not aware of. That means that's why you get these amazing demonstrations and so on. And I think that if you've got a basic understanding of experimental control, in general terms about things like sensory leakage and how to design a properly controlled study, most psychics would not be able to even come close to performing or fooling you. But as I say, most of them are not deliberate con artists anyway. That's not why they're doing it. They're doing this test because they want you to validate that they really do have these amazing powers and tell the world about it, which obviously if you ever found anybody who really could do it, we would do that, but they can't.